How we doing? Good? You guys making it? It's so good to see you guys. We are going to be starting today a brand new series that's going to take us about 3 years. Okay? We got it all mapped out, all right? Make sure you're here every Sunday. You don't want to miss a thing. No, it will take us about 3 years, but it's not going to all be focused right week after week in Matthew. We're going to be taking a break every few months or so to tackle some other stuff. But just know that this is something that we are committed to doing because we really feel like it's important to get all of what the text says to us out, right? So this is more of a marathon than a sprint, okay? So today we're going to start in Matthew chapter 1 because that's where you start when you start a series, right? You start at the beginning. Now, here, I want you guys to do something with me here. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to imagine, kind of get in your mind's eye, the greatest movie or book you can ever imagine. All right, like your all-time favorite. It may be science fiction, it may be some kind of history, or it may be something else. I don't know, but like what in your mind is like, this is the story. Now, every story that is in our minds right now has a beginning. Like there's kind of like a backstory that goes into it. For an example, before there was The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, there was The Hobbit, right? With Gollum and Bilbo Baggins and the whole storyline that unfolds there. Before there was Star Wars A New Hope, episode 4. They started in 4, not sure, but there was The Phantom Menace, right? Number 1. Before there was a Beyonce, there was Destiny's Child. And believe it or not, before Destiny's Child, there was actually another thing called Girls' Time. Just, you look that up on your own. You're welcome, all right? Before, when I think of the greatest movie of all time, I think of this amazing cinematic drama that involves a man who, at birth, was adopted by this whole family of people who are nothing like him. And he grew up in this household that was nothing like him, and he eventually realized he was different. And so he went on a journey to go find his long-lost family, only to discover that they didn't even know he existed. And it was just the whole story is about this amazing relationship between this man and his family and reconciliation. Of course, I'm talking about Elf, right? The greatest Christmas movie of all time, and I will fight you for that, okay? So if you have any questions or concerns about that, let's talk. But every story we have has a backstory, right? Every single one. And it's part of that backstory that helps us understand what's going on in the present circumstance. And the story of our Rabbi Jesus is no different. So we're going to look in Matthew chapter 1, and it begins in verse 1 with a very curious statement. It says this: "The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." Now, how many of you, your translations say something like that? Is that pretty, right here, pretty, yeah. Like most of us, that's kind of what our Bibles say. And that's pretty good. It's a pretty good translation, except it's a bit misleading. And I don't think it's misleading intentionally. I think there's just some other stuff happening that the translators didn't really bring to light. For an example, the Greek word for this whole opening phrase, I'm going to see if I can say this right, is Biblios Geneseos Jesu Christou. All right? And it comes from 2 words you can see right out of the gate. The first word is Biblios, which sounds a lot like our word Bible, right? And it's a Greek word that literally means book. Sometimes when we hold this thing together, it's a collection of different things put together, and we would call this a book, but it's actually a library. There's 66 books involved in what's bound in this particular text. Some of them are historical, some are biographical, some are more of like artistic and creative, like poetry, and there's everything in between. And what Matthew is saying here is this, like what I'm about to tell you is a book of something different. It's a piece of what's going on in the bigger story. The second word that's there is the word, let's see if I can say this right too, Geneseos. Geneseos. Now, a lot of times our translations translate that as an account or genealogy, except that's actually not the original word that's there. The original word there, Geneseos, doesn't mean genealogy, it means Genesis. Another way of looking at it is it means origin story. Now, if you were a first century Jew who Matthew is writing to, your mind would have been starting to make some connections. Because this phrase or something like it actually appears back in the book of Genesis, the beginning of the Bible. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, it says this in the Greek. It says, Hautos he biblios geneseos oranu kai ges, which literally means the book of the origin story of the heavens and the earth. And so what Matthew's doing is saying, hey, remember that? This is tying into that. One author, C.S. Lewis, who's one of my favorites, he says that another word for origin story is myth. Now, if that begins to ruffle your feathers, just hang on a second because he unpacks it really well. He says it this way. He says, the value of the myth is that it takes all the things we know and restores to them the rich significance which has been hidden by the veil of familiarity. The child enjoys his cold meat, otherwise dull to him, by pretending it is buffalo, just killed with his own bow and arrow. And the child is wise. The real meat comes back to him more savory for having been dipped in a story. By putting bread, gold, horse, apple, or the very roads into a myth, we do not retreat from reality, we rediscover it. And then he ends it this way. He says, the story of Christ is simply a true myth. A myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference that it really happened. See, for Matthew and for Lewis, this story that he's getting ready to unpack explains all the other stories. It's the key that locks not just the story of Jesus' biography or his biology. It's the key that ties in everything else. It's the key that unlocks the story, your story and my story, the story of the universe. And what he's saying is this man, Jesus of Nazareth, he wasn't just like a blip on a radar. He wasn't just kind of some guy who was passing through. It was like, hey, he had some stuff to say. Let's kind of jot some of this stuff down. No, there's something much deeper. He was saying, hey, this guy, if you really want to know all about yourself, your desires, your fears, your longings, your cravings, your brokenness, then you've got to dig deeper into what is happening here. So he begins by unpacking Jesus' origin story in the form of a genealogy. But it's not the way that we would think of genealogy. It's actually the history of Israel going before our eyes. So here we are. We're going to read Matthew 1 through 17. And yes, we're going to read every name. All right? So, buckle up, Buttercup. Here it comes. An account of the genealogy or origin story of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Aram, and Aram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. You guys still good? All right, let's keep going. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat. Ryan, that's a really good name for the baby that's to come, okay? Jehoshaphat, make it happen. And Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, Jotham the father of Ahaz, Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, Manasseh the father of Amos, Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. We're almost there. Let's keep going. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel was the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, Zadok the father of Akim, and Akim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Matan, and Matan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. You made it. Congratulations. I feel like we should all just take one big deep breath and go, it's going to be okay, right? Now, what Matthew does here in this long list of 41 names is, I think, two things that he wants to show us today to help us understand his story better and to help us understand who this Jesus of Nazareth is and how it applies to our life, okay? Now, I'm going to get a little nerdy on you, okay? So just be prepared. Get out your pen, your notebook, whatever. You can go back and watch this. If you're listening online, you may want to pause this occasionally just to kind of be able to wrap your brain around what's going on, because I think it's really important. The first thing Matthew's getting at here is something called numerology. Numerology. And numerology is the study of number patterns in the text, right? If you read the Old Testament, you begin to see that there's numbers that begin to pop off the page. And they're not just randomly put in there or like, oh, isn't that kind of a coincidence? They are designed to be there on purpose so as to create links or like road maps or even like neon signs saying this is important. For an example, the number 3. You see it all throughout the Scripture, Old and New Testament, right? 3 is what they call the holy number. And you see it over and over again. It represents the Trinity, right? Father, Spirit, and Son. Or the number 3 also appears when Jesus dies on a Friday. And how many days later does he come back? 3 days later, right? So the number 3 is really important. It's just a kind of example. Well, Matthew piggybacks on this idea with his own set of numbers. One is very obvious right out of the gate, and the other two are a little more subtle. So we're going to start with the most obvious one and kind of work our way through. Let's look back at verse 17 again. It says this: so all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David to deportation to Babylon, how many? 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, how many? 14 generations. Good, you guys are awake. I love this. All right, so the most obvious number here is what? The number 14. Now, in biblical theology, the number 14 represents divine deliverance or salvation. Like the most important day in the Jewish year, or the most important time of the year, is what they call Passover. And Passover happened in the first month on the 14th day. Like it was a big, really big, important day. And so to understand why Matthew brings out the number 14 in this genealogy, we actually have to go back 700 years to a guy named Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 9. You don't have to turn, it'll be on the screen. Isaiah writes what's called a messianic prophecy, saying, hey, there's a guy who's going to come and he's going to do something pretty big. You may have heard these verses in connection with Christmas time, all right? So here it is. Isaiah chapter 9, it says this: the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who lived in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. For the yoke of their burden and the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor you have broken. For a child has been born for us, a son given to us. Authority rests upon his shoulders, and he is named a Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. This is the kicker. And his authority shall grow continually. And there shall be endless peace for the throne of David and his kingdom. He will establish it and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time onward and forevermore. So here's what's happening. Isaiah is talking about how one day David, who was the greatest king in Israeli history, was going to have a son. And this son was going to basically come through and bring everything under his rule. He was going to bring peace and prosperity. It was going to be awesome. Now, what's happening in Matthew's time when he's writing this, he's writing it to a group of people who are currently under not this kingship of David, but under Roman authority and Roman rule. It was very oppressive. It was very difficult. It was very trying and tumultuous. And so they're longing, they're waiting for this king to show up. They're waiting for this Messiah or anointed one to show up. And so when Matthew's kind of going through this 14, he's hearkening it back to Isaiah, because at the peak of this is a guy named David. Now, to kind of really dig deep and go really, for all of you Bible nerds like me out here, okay, this is going to flip your mind here, okay? In the Old Testament, they had this thing called the Gematria. Now, the Gematria is basically a fancy word that you take a letter and you assign a number to it. For us, it would be like A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, so on and so forth, right? You guys with me? So what you do is you have this genealogy, and at the center of this genealogy with 14 generations everywhere is a guy named David. Well, if you take David's name and you take out all the vowels, because that's the way that the Hebrews would have read it, it actually forms the letters D, V, D. And what you do is you take each one of those letters and you assign it a number, the way that the Hebrews would have understood. And the letter D has this number 4 associated with it. The letter V has a number 6 associated with it. And so what happens is when you have D, V, D at the apex of this genealogy, 6, 4, and 4, what does that equal? 14. And so what Matthew's doing, he's saying, hey, this isn't just an accident. There's something deeper going on here. David is at the peak, and this prophecy of a Messiah who's going to come, who's going to be one of David's ancestors, he's going to come. It's in this genealogy, and it ends with the last guy who is there, who is Jesus. Now that was the most obvious of the numbers that Matthew's readers would have been like, dude, that's amazing. But he keeps going. 14 is made up of 2 other numbers, right? The number 2 and the number 7. All right, 3rd grade. Come on, guys. Are you ready? All right. I think we're all here, right? The number 7 is important because you see here there's like generations, 7 generations of 7. There's 7 generations. And the last name on that would have been the name Jesus. So Jesus is starting the 7th generation. That's kind of a little bit of a mind teaser there. But here's why this is important. When you look at the way the world was ordered from the very beginning, Genesis 1 tells us that God worked for 6 days, and on the 7th day, he did what? He rested. And so when you have the 7th 7, what Matthew is showing us is that all of these other generations, these groups of 7, have been like those 6 days of work. But then the 7th 7, God's peace, God's rest is coming into fruition through this 7th 7, the perfection of perfection, who is Jesus of Nazareth. But then there's one more, and this one, y'all, like I chewed on this for days, and I was so giddy when I discovered this one. It's probably the least obvious, but it's there. It's the number 40. The number 40. Now here's why this is important. 40 appears all throughout the Bible, Old and New Testament. Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness. Right, you guys remember that story? Elijah that we talked about a few weeks ago wandered for 40 days on this hike to get to Mount Sinai. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before he went to Pharaoh and said, let my people go. Right? Well, the number 40 is really, really huge. Well, one of the reasons that it's so big is because after Moses went to Pharaoh and said, let my people go, Pharaoh said, fine, but not without a fight. And the Israelites wandered in the wilderness for how long? 40 years before they finally got to the promised land. Now, in the midst of that, a lot of awesome and miraculous things happened. There was also a lot of heartache and some difficulty as well. But in the midst of that, God gave to the Israelites something called the law. We call it the 10 Commandments. And he gave it to a guy named Moses. So Moses is leading the people for 40 years through the wilderness. He's kind of representing the law of God to these people. Well, Moses ended up doing something that kind of cost him his entrance ticket into the promised land. God said, hey, you can't go, but I'm going to anoint your apprentice, a guy named Joshua, who's going to take the people in the 41st year of exile or of wandering in the wilderness into the land that I promised them. So here it is. Moses is anointing Joshua in the 41st year to go into the promised land. Now, Joshua is actually not his real name. His Hebrew name is actually Yeshua, which means God saves. Now, here's where it gets crazy. When you go through and you count the names in this genealogy, from Abraham to Joseph, Mary's husband, is 40 names. The 41st name, the last thing that's mentioned, is Jesus. It's as if what Matthew is saying is like, hey, there's a name for every year that Israel walked in the wilderness and wandered in the wilderness. But here's where it gets cool, is that 41st name, Jesus is actually not his real original name. It's a Greek name. His original name in the Hebrew was actually Yeshua. So what you see here happening is Matthew saying, hey, just like Moses, the law could not take everybody into the promised land, but a Yeshua, God as our salvation, in the 41st year is ushering God's people into this land of promise and rest and peace. So too, a second Yeshua who comes on the scene will take God's people, not through the law, but through something even greater, into rest and peace. John chapter 1 actually kind of confirms this. He says this. He says, the law came through Moses, and it wasn't enough to get them through. The law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus the Christ. Now, nerd session over, okay? Here's why this matters. In the midst of what has been 2020, political divide, moms and dads against their kids, neighbors against one another, in the year where a pandemic seems to be raging out of control with no end in sight but a lot of broken promises, it can feel like we are simply lost in the chaos. But there is and always has been a plan. God is still in control. And what you see through Matthew's genealogy is the birth of Jesus was no accident. What we're going through right now is no accident. And it feels chaotic and difficult and hard and like we're wandering in the wilderness. However, for all of those who are apprentices of Jesus, there is an ushering in of peace and stability because God is still in control. Now, that's the first thing I think Matthew wants to show us. The second thing is a little less grammatic, but I think a little bit more real, especially for me in my life. And it's the idea of the anthropology of Jesus. The anthropology is kind of a scholarly word that just means people, humankind. In Jewish history, there are 4 what they call matriarchs. Right? The first one was Sarah, who was Abraham's wife. She couldn't have a baby, right, until she was like 90-something years old. And so what does God do? God says, hey, you're going to have a baby. Miraculously, she has a baby. His name was Isaac. Isaac ended up marrying a girl named Rebekah, who was his wife and also his cousin. So just there's that, right? And they had Jacob. And Jacob ended up marrying 2 women, Rachel and Leah. And between those 2, they had 12 kids, which we call the 12 tribes of Judah, right? The 12 tribes of Israel. Now, when you're listing out a genealogy, those are the people that you want in your genealogy because they are the best of the best. They are the amazing ones. And you're like, yes, please. But what's interesting is Matthew doesn't list any of those guys or gals. He has 4 different matriarchs, which are very interesting because they are actually the antithesis of what you would have been expecting. First off, he talks about Tamar. Tamar, Genesis chapter 38. I would just encourage you to look that up. It's a story that is not very PG. She's a woman who acted like a prostitute in order to get her father-in-law to sleep with her so she could have a son. Exhibit number 2, Rahab. If you know the story of Rahab in Joshua chapter 2, again, she was somebody who had questionable sexual ethics, but who hid the spies, believed God, and God ended up using her, even though her past was very sordid and broken. Number 3, there was Ruth. Ruth appears in Ruth chapter 3. She's afraid that she's not going to be able to have an heir. So she convinces somebody she's related to, a guy named Boaz, to get him to sleep with her so that she could have an heir. Then you got number 4. He doesn't even call her by name, the wife of Uriah. We know her as Bathsheba in 2 Samuel chapter 11. She was married to a guy named Uriah, and then she just either seduced or was seduced by, not really clear, King David, got pregnant, and then was a part of a plot to have her husband assassinated so that they could actually have this whatever relationship. Like, these are the guys and gals that Matthew chooses to put in there. And here's why that's significant. All 4 women had questionable behavior, and all 4 women were not Jewish. They were all Gentile. They were not the people that you would want in your genealogy. It's as if Matthew is saying this, hey, Jesus' origin story was designed to show that all of those who are considered far off by cultural standards, the marginalized, the oppressed, the non-religious, the outcast, the ones that nobody else wants because they're mentally or emotionally, spiritually, physically, or even sexually broken, not only have an opportunity to be in the story, their very lives, their very own origin stories are intertwined with that of Jesus. Rodney Reeves, New Testament scholar, I love this. He says it this way. He says, Jesus' genealogical roots sink deep into the dirt of humanity. He didn't become one of us. He is one of us. All of us. The good, the bad, and the ugly. There are certain things about your origin story that you have no control over. Your DNA. You didn't ask for that. You didn't ask to have blonde hair, blue eyes, brown hair, green eyes. You didn't ask for any of that. It just was given to you. Your name. You may go by a different name now or a nickname, but the name that was given to you was something given to you with all of the hopes and the dreams and whatever of your parents or whoever took care of you. You had no say in that initially. How about your parents? You didn't get to pick them. You didn't get to choose them. They simply are your biological parents. That relationship may be broken or it may be great, but it is what it is. For some of us, our family of origin is not very exciting, nor does it bring a sense of gladness. Maybe the home you grew up in wasn't that great of a home. Maybe there was abuse. Maybe there was abandonment or neglect. Maybe there was addiction, personality issues, religious issues, whatever. Or maybe you're here this morning and you're like, dude, I had a great home. My parents loved me. They cared for me. But even if you grew up in the best home, there are things about your origin story that you are going to have to work through before you can move forward in maturity with your apprenticeship to Jesus. You're going to have to work through them. That said, even though your family of origin informs who you are, it does not have to define who you are. Let me say that again. Even though your family of origin may inform who you are, it does not have to define who you are. And what I love about Jesus' origin story is it doesn't end with the line, Jesus, the son of Joseph. It ends with Jesus, who is the Christ. It's as if Matthew is saying, hey, all of these people contributed to Jesus' physical presence here on earth, his biology, but they do not determine his ability nor his capacity to do something great. I was listening to Bob Goff. He has a great podcast called Dream Big. And he was saying this past week, he said, every single one of us live either in a reflection of or a reaction to our parents. Everything we do is either a reflection of what our parents did. You ever find yourself saying something and you're like, oh my gosh, I sound like my mother, right? Or it's in reaction to your parents. My dad was this, I will never be that. So often we find ourselves repeating those same things. But and it may be a combination of the two. But in Jesus' origin story, we don't get the sense that he became the amazing teacher that he was because he was trying to prove that he wasn't like his old family, right? I'm nothing like my great-great-grandmother who did, questionable things. He understood his ability to live the life he was supposed to and designed to live was because he was comfortable in who God had made him to be, the role he was created to fulfill, inspired by or in spite of his family of origin. Here's the beauty. Here's the beauty of this passage. Your origin story filled with trauma or hope, filled with a pressure to succeed, or filled with overwhelming disappointment, does not begin with your alcoholic parents. It does not begin with your emotionally distant father or mother. It doesn't begin with your perfectionistic patronage or your lack of any parenting whatsoever. These things may inform you positively or negatively, but they do not have to define you. Instead, what Matthew is saying is this: you are an image-bearing, God-loving, Christ-shaped, Spirit-filled apprentice of Jesus. And once this begins to sink in, it will begin to transform you. And transformed people transform people. N.T. Wright, I love what he says here, especially in light of our present circumstances. He says this: our task as image-bearing, God-loving, Christ-shaped, Spirit-filled Christians, following Christ and shaping our world, is to announce redemption to a world that has discovered its fallenness, to announce healing to a world that has discovered its brokenness, to proclaim love and trust to a world that only knows exploitation, fear, and suspicion. Once we begin to understand that our origin story may inform us, but it doesn't have to define us, we begin to really experience freedom and peace and joy. So here's what we're going to do, okay? I'm going to give you a little bit of homework, because one of the things we do here, our vision statement is we exist to bring hope to our community by practicing the way of Jesus until it is in Nashville as it is in heaven. So I want to every week give you a practice to help you walk this way, okay? So this week's practice, we're going to do something called a genogram. Now, a genogram, you may have heard it simply as a family tree or something like that. You can go like all kinds of awesome on this, and I'm not saying you have to go deep into this, but what I want to do is I want to begin to show you or allow you to have an opportunity to begin to see patterns that have emerged in your own life as a result of the family that you've grown up with. Because once you begin to identify those patterns, that's where you can begin to go, okay, I need to stop that. And what I've discovered is that sometimes, many times, writing it out helps. So at some point this week, you can go and get an index card, or you can get a journal or something. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to kind of draw, I can put, this is mine. You write your name at the top. I wrote my name, Jason, and then I have two people below me. That's my mom and my dad, Johnny and Valerie. And you can see beneath each one of those is 3 dots. I'm going to explain those in just a minute. Beneath each one of those, you have my grandparents. My dad's parents, Martha and Henry. My mom's parents, Polly, good old Southern name, and Jim. And each of those dots, here's what I want you to do. I want you to write out maybe a character trait or a memory or something in that line that it could be a bullet point, something just kind of jog your memory with what that means. And you can go as deep as you want to with this. I put 3 points because sometimes we can go really, really deep and it's not time for that yet. But what I want you to do is in those 3 dots, write out a word or a phrase, something that makes sense to you. And then as you're going through this with your grandparents, with your parents, then do the same thing in your own life with 3 dots and begin to see if a pattern emerges. At this point, I'm not saying you have to do anything major with it, but just notice it. Because sometimes we are where we are because we have just kind of gone on autopilot and begun to just cruise without realizing that we're cruising and something else is at the steering wheel. And the minute we can begin to take hold of that steering wheel, the minute we can begin to experience freedom. Your family of origin, listen, your grandparents, your parents, they may inform you. They do not have to define you. You can be better. You can be set free. You can be more than just those words of abuse or negativity or brokenness that were spoken over you as a kid. It does not have to define you. If anything, Jesus' genealogy teaches us, it's that our family of origin has a lot to play in our lives, but it does not necessarily determine everything about our future. The invitation of Jesus is to be his apprentice, to have your life defined by being with him, becoming like him, and doing what he did, even though your biology, your family of origin may say otherwise. Let's stand together and pray, can we?